In our previous video, we learned that a sentence is a complete grammatical idea that contains at least one subject and predicate relationship. We learned two general types of sentences, basic or simple sentence and compound, and each follows a general pattern. Simple sentences contain only one complete subject and predicate relationship, while compound sentences contain at least two complete subject-predicate relationships connected by, usually, a coordinate conjunction. In the last part of this series, we are going to expand our knowledge of sentences by exploring the third pattern, called complex sentences. We will then wrap up with a final ear training exercise to review what we have learned. Now again, in our discussion of a sentence, we have talked quite a bit about what is necessary compared to what is possible. So again, we talked about the fact that sentences must contain at least one complete clause, which involves a subject and predicate relationship, and that any of these ideas must satisfy their own grammatical relationships as well. So thinking about the ideas of logic and location, for example, we discussed the fact that subjects and verbs must agree. This is part of the idea that there are many different relationships going on at the same time. Now, of course, we did discuss what is possible, and this is getting to the next idea of looking at a compound sentence. For example, it is possible to add more complete clauses to a sentence by using what we have discussed as a coordinating conjunction. So in this way, we can redefine this information again. Now we have the difference between a basic or simple sentence compared to a compound sentence. Now, as we mentioned before, when we think about these ideas, it's always best to review information so that we're always constantly kind of reminding ourselves what they mean. For example, with predicates, as we said before, there are generally three kinds of predicate ideas. Predicates that use action verbs that are transitive or intransitive. So again, if it's a transitive action verb, it might require an object. And then, of course, states of being verbs, or what we call linking verbs, with noun or adjective complements. Compound sentences really just kind of expand on the idea and the fact that we're adding yet another complete subject-predicate idea. When we talked about coordinating conjunctions, we focused mainly on the 5 most common, which can be seen here. Now, coordinating conjunctions are not the only ideas that can connect complete clauses, but that's all we're going to focus on in this video series. But if you notice here, things we have to remember is that coordinating conjunctions often are separated using commas, especially when you have two different sort of sentence ideas, and even more so if you had two different subjects. Now recall that these basic patterns that we've been talking about are defined in a minimal way. So in other words, this tells us that this is what is necessary to create the sentence, but not necessarily what is completely possible. So the problem, of course, is when we try to add more information, it becomes more and more difficult to maintain that grammatical balance, keeping all of the relationships in the sentence logical and complete. In our previous video, we showed 5 sentences that had some sort of mistake. And most of these, of course, were involving the ideas we discussed when it came to talking about the ideas of grammar. So again, these sentences each had a particular mistake. And now the idea is to see if we can find the answers. So now we're about ready to reveal what the answers are. So first off, I'm going to show the correct answers here on the screen, and you'll find the correct or the corrections themselves in red. Then we will go through and analyze each one. So let's start with the first one. Our problem with the original sentence is that we had bad location. Now, of course, this relates to the idea of order. Everything in the sentence was essentially correct in terms of logic, but the word order was incorrect. In other words, the adverbs that we had in the predicate were not exactly following in a logical way. In general, adverbs of place go before adverbs of time in the predicate. So in this case, we had to switch at home and last night. So this is information that we can recognize here when we go back to the profile of an adverb. So some particular rules and limitations are the fact that adverbs, especially those modifying verbs, do follow a certain order. For example, adverbs of manner would go before an adverb of place, then of course would go before an adverb of time. Now, not all of these ideas will be present in the sentence, but if they are, we have to remember the order or location that they follow. In our second example, the problem was we had two complete ideas, but we didn't demonstrate how exactly those ideas need to be kind of shown to relate to each other. So in this case, we were missing a word or we had an incorrect idea. So since we had two complete clauses, we needed to separate them, either into two complete sentences, which of course we did here with a period, or we needed to add some sort of conjunction to connect them. So in some grammar textbooks, this is referred to as a run-on sentence, where you have basically two sentences run together, but they don't appear to be separated correctly. So again, the idea here is that if we're going to use two complete sentences, either we need to separate them with periods, or we need to use some sort of coordinating conjunction idea, or something like that, to connect these two sentences. So again, we also recognize that a simple sentence contains only one subject-predicate idea. But the moment we introduce more, we have to figure out how to connect them, either through a conjunction or to separate them maybe with a period. Okay, let's look at our third example. In this case, we had a subject-verb agreement problem. So if you notice, we have two complete clauses here, and they're connected by that coordinating conjunction, so. Now if we notice, she is referring to the word Janet. So in this case, Janet is basically the subject of both parts. So she, of course, is the pronoun replacing Janet, which meant that the verb that followed needed to be changed to the singular third person. So in this case, we needed to change the verb to eats. As we said before, one of the rules and limitations with action verbs is that they contain at least a subject and verb in a sentence, and of course they have to agree in a singular or plural way. Again, this is one of the requirements that we discussed. Once again, we had a problem with subject-verb agreement. Now, this is a common confusing problem here. So let's take a look here and see why this is such a common issue. Part of the problem is the prepositional phrase. If you'll notice, it's here. And actually, I'll use a pen tool to demonstrate where it is, to indicate where it is. So if we notice, we have a prepositional phrase here in the original sentence. The key, of course, is to think about what exactly is its purpose. Remember, that's one of the key ideas of grammar, is to think about, if we're going to put a prepositional phrase here, what's its purpose? Well, in this case, its purpose is to help clarify what exactly one means. So in a way, it's modifying the word one to tell us that it's actually one movie. Now again, this prepositional phrase, as often happens in English, is sort of clarifying or modifying the word one. So this is something new that maybe you haven't learned, or maybe we've kind of talked about, but something you can start to recognize. Thinking about the functions of prepositional phrases, well, again, they often function as adverbs or adjectives. That's kind of their purpose. So oftentimes you will find them next to a noun, for example, or after a verb. In fact, we can see prepositional phrases in many places in a sentence. So as we said earlier, they can function like adverbs. They can also function like adjectives. So we haven't talked a lot about that idea, but that is something you will recognize. That's one of the reasons why you find so many prepositions in a sentence, is because they're often modifying things. Okay, in our next example, we had something that was incorrect. And again, another common confusion is especially between adverbs and adjectives because they often look very similar. We have to recall that adverb quickly does not modify nouns. It can modify adjectives or verbs. So in this case, we had the word quickly and we needed to change it to the adjective form so that it would be appropriately describing the word thinker. Because what we have here is this kind of noun complement, a quick thinker. So we had to change the word quickly to quick. As we said before, this is one of the limitations of adverbs, is that adverbs cannot modify nouns themselves. So, after looking at some situations where we had to correct information, it's time to move on to our final idea of our video series. And that's thinking about when things get a little more complicated than just basic or simple sentence ideas. Now, as we said before, basic or simple sentences are essentially collections of words and phrases that play specific roles. For example, we said subjects of a sentence can be a word or could be a phrase. Verbs could be a word or a phrase. Objects could be a word or a phrase. Adverbs could be a word or a phrase. Adjectives could be a word or a phrase. And then, of course, we've discussed already about prepositional phrases themselves can act as an adverb or adjective modifying idea. But what would happen if we decided to change these a little bit? In other words, what if we were to substitute another clause in the same place of some of the other words or phrases in the sentence in order to express an idea that might be a little more complex? Let's demonstrate. So let's start with an adjective. As we know, an adjective describes a noun, and it can describe it in many different ways. Appearance, location, quantity, like how many foxes or where. Now let's add a little more information. So watch what happens when we add another adjective phrase. So let's try a prepositional phrase. So in this case, in purple, you'll notice the prepositional phrase is modifying the subject like an adjective. Now let's demonstrate this. If we think about it, we can think about what prepositional phrases do, and perhaps the best way to do it is visually. So what we're trying to do is distinguish one kind of fox from another. So in our original example, we noticed that we have the brown fox. Now the truth is there might be another type of fox present. And of course we said the lazy dog, and there could be another kind of dog present too. Notice in our previous example we've got a dog here that's not asleep or not lazy, and we've got a fox here that's not a brown fox. So when we say the brown fox, it's the only brown fox here, even though there might be other foxes. Just like we have the lazy dog, well, there could be other dogs here, but this is the only lazy dog we're talking about. Now watch what happens when we get even more specific by adding the fact that it's in the field. So the brown fox in the field. So now it's not only just any brown fox, it's only the one in the field. So for example, in these pictures, notice I have a fox on the road, and it's even brown. Again, this fox here seems to be sitting perhaps on a hill, but it's a different color. So in this case, the brown fox in the field is to distinguish between maybe other brown foxes on a road or other foxes of different color. So notice the more prepositions or adjectives we add to the idea, it becomes more and more specific. Now, of course, since these words modify the subject, we would again refer to them as being part of the complete subject phrase. So all of this would be representative of the subject, since they all modify the word fox. Now, we could continue to add more information. Remember, we talked about the fact that it might be possible. But what if we wanted to express something even more complex? Well, now notice what I did. I took out the prepositional phrase, but now I've added something even a little bit longer. Now, let's analyze it first before we kind of get any further. And again, I'll use my pen tool to kind of demonstrate. So notice, for example, we've added this entire expression. And this particular expression has what appears to be another verb. And already that looks kind of confusing. because we know that jumped is the main verb that we've been focusing on. So the first question is, what exactly is this particular idea doing? Well, again, we've added this concept, which appears to be another clause. There's another verb there. But we notice that there is no coordinating conjunction idea here. In fact, we've got a different word, and that's the word which. Well, you see, this is what we call a different kind of clause. This is called a dependent clause. You see, the dependent clause is added to the sentence because it's actually doing something specific. It's not making the sentence, it's not adding another compound idea to the sentence or another complete idea. Instead, it's creating something that depends on something else in the sentence to be there. Well, this is what we now call a complex sentence. So complex sentences, as we've noticed already, they contain dependent clauses, and this is different from simple sentences. Dependent clauses require something called a subordinating connector, not a coordinating conjunction. And these help connect the dependent clause to the main sentence, or the independent clause. Now, one thing you're going to notice is that these dependent clauses function as an existing part of speech. So in our example, the dependent clause was functioning as an adjective. So watch what happens. We've got this connector which is connecting the dependent clause idea, which I've highlighted here in orange, to the entire independent idea. Now, of course, the question is, how is it functioning? Well, again, the blue part is the main sentence. If I removed the adjective or dependent clause, you notice the sentence basically would go back to the original sentence we've created. But you see, the dependent clause here is giving us more information. It is modifying the word fox, which in this case is now before the adjective idea. So again, look at the sentence very carefully. This is not just any brown fox. This is a brown fox which is also next to the tree. So in this case, we're kind of defining this fox as not just any fox, though there's probably just one brown fox in the area, but now we're giving some extra information. It's telling us where the fox is located, which one if I had others to choose from. So again, this is a dependent clause that's functioning as an adjective. It's describing the word fox. Now, since the dependent clause is functioning as an adjective, now it also becomes part of the complete subject. But you cannot call this a subject phrase, mainly because this particular idea does have another verb. So again, that complicates things a little bit. So again, that's why we call this a dependent clause. It needs something in the sentence for its particular existence. So now we've created a complex subject. And again, we can still call this the complete subject because now it all belongs together. Remember, a sentence, and this is really just one sentence because there's only one main verb here. This sentence, not a simple sentence, but a single subject-predicate sentence, now, as we said before, we can really divide into two parts, the subject and the predicate. So this part must belong to the subject. So another interesting thing is notice that this particular clause doesn't have a separate subject of its own. The word which, in a way, is helping to kind of connect or serve as a substitute. Well, that's because the brown fox is the actual subject of this particular clause. Now, that doesn't happen with every clause, but it does happen with adjective clauses quite often. So this is another way that many adjective clauses function in a complex sentence. So now we can redefine this information further. You see, we take a compound sentence and kind of compare it to a complex sentence. Now, of course, as we said before, there are some things that can be tricky. For example, in both situations, we're adding more subjects and verbs, but only with the compound sentences are we creating a situation where we have two independent clauses together. And these independent clauses are connected by coordinating connectors. And again, that's the important thing to remember. However, for complex sentences, we do have one independent clause, and of course there could be more, but we also have what's called a dependent clause. And we can recognize the dependent clause many times because they begin with this subordinating connector. Now, as we will see, as we kind of finish up in this video series, there are three types of dependent clauses. So first off, we've already seen adjective clauses, which do function like adjectives, like simple adjectives. Of course, there are some key differences. First off, adjective clauses go after the noun they're describing, not before. They contain that subordinating connector to help connect to the main sentence, which or the independent clause, we should say. And in many cases, the subject of the adjective clause is also a noun in the independent clause or main sentence. And finally, we notice that adjective clauses are usually separated from the independent clause with commas. So punctuation is also very helpful here to identify an adjective clause. Now, the other two types of dependent clauses are called noun clauses and adverb clauses. Now, we will demonstrate how they function just kind of basically in this video series. However, we do explore them in greater detail in the Advanced Grammar online course, which is currently in production right now. Now, we already demonstrated with an adjective clause. So notice we have that connector at the beginning, which is the word which. And notice how it fits into an existing sentence. In this way, it's going to separate the sentence. In a way so that it's kind of tricky at first to recognize where is the main subject and main verb. So again, the main subject of the independent clause is fox, or the brown fox. And the main verb is the verb jumped. Here in our dependent clause, we have now what we could redefine as a dependent verb. So notice this verb here is not the main verb of the sentence. It belongs together with this entire clause. But this clause's purpose is to connect back to the noun that it's describing. So as we said before, think of all of this now as the complete subject, because it's describing the word fox still. Okay, now let's look at an example of a noun clause and watch what happens. So first off, let's bring in this clause, what is known as. Now watch what happens when we try to put it in the sentence. So the first question is to think about, where do noun clauses go? Well, noun clauses go where nouns can typically be found in a sentence. So, for example, this noun clause has now become the subject of the independent clause. So all of this idea is treated together. All of this is part of the noun, what is known as the brown fox. Of course, noun clauses also contain subordinating connectors, so in this case the word what helps connect the information to the rest of the sentence. Now, we can also have nouns in the place of where we would typically find objects. So in this case, what if I change the sentence a little bit and now put the phrase or clause, what is known as, and then change it to the lazy dog? Now it becomes basically the object of the independent idea. So now it becomes part of the predicate. The brown fox, and then the rest of the sentence. Finally, let's look at adverb clauses. And again, adverb clauses function just as adverbs do. So in this case, we have the clause, when it began to rain. Now, where do adverb clauses go? Well, typically we can find them at the end of the predicate. So in this case, after the verb and the predicate idea. So that word when is the connecting word we're looking for. That's the subordinating connector to, in this case, the word when. So some things to remember. Dependent clauses almost always begin with those subordinating connectors, the ones that we saw demonstrated in this video. We also saw that dependent clauses can be one of three parts of speech: adjective clauses, noun clauses, or adverb clauses. Each of these clauses contain a subject and predicate idea, but remember, the dependent clause is not the main clause of the sentence, so these would not be the main subject or predicate. In fact, many textbooks refer to them as the dependent subject and dependent predicate. So now, for our final activity, look at the following sentences and try to identify whether they are simple, compound sentences, or complex sentences. And again, be careful, some of these are probably tricky. Now first off, take a look at the sentences. The Mediterranean monk seal is one of the most endangered animals on Earth. The bus left as soon as I got on. You can either catch a streetcar at the corner or walk 2 blocks to the train station. Our teacher, who has a wonderful sense of humor, told us a wonderful story. If I get married someday, I hope to buy a house in the suburbs and plant a garden. Now here are the answers. Now first off, as you look at the situation, again, look at the sentences and see if you can find out which ones might be simple sentences. I'll give you a moment to study the screen. You may even want to hit pause on the video so that you can study it more closely. Okay, are we ready? Well, in this case, only the first sentence can be considered a simple sentence. And we'll get out our pen tool to demonstrate. First off, we notice that as we scan through the sentence, we find really only one verb here. And as we recognize, it's a state of being verb, or a linking verb. So first off, this tells us that the information we're going to see before it is most likely the subject, which in this case we have the subject phrase, the Mediterranean monk seal. So this would be considered the subject of the verb. And the rest of the sentence would be considered a complement. Now, is it a noun complement or an adjective complement? Well, if you look at the word one is a noun. So in this case, it would be a noun complement. So again, the more I look through the sentence, I see that there really is only one subject and one verb idea, or one predicate, complete. So in this case, this would be the only example of a simple sentence from the list we have here. Okay? So we'll kind of highlight that sentence to put it in the background now. And now look at the remaining sentences and see if you can identify which one or ones are compound sentences. Take a moment and study the screen. Are we ready? In this case, only this one would qualify as a compound sentence. Now, part of the idea is to study the fact that the type of connecting we're using is a conjunction or a coordinating idea, but actually it's what we call a paired idea. First off, you do notice the word or. That's usually a pretty good sign that this is going to be a coordinating idea. But then we also have the word either. This is what we call a paired conjunction, in which you have the expression either or. And since this is the predominant connecting word we have in the sentence, we probably recognize that this is most likely compound. Now we also can tell because we have one verb here and another verb here. So in this case, it looks most likely to be the closest thing we have to a compound sentence in our example. We have two complete verbs and predicate subject ideas. You is the subject actually of both parts. So what does this tell us? Well, it tells us that the remaining sentences are complex sentences. And again, let's analyze why. Well, again, first off, if you'll notice, we do have the bus left as the first idea. And this does appear to be a complete predicate, subject-predicate idea. Now, of course, what is the function of this last part here? As soon as, and then notice we have another subject and verb. Well, one thing you're going to learn in the advanced grammar class is that the connector belongs with the actual clause itself. So in this case, we would have to put all of this together. We couldn't leave out the word as soon as. So in this case, you recognize right away that this is not a complete idea. In other words, you could not use this part as a complete sentence. You couldn't say, as soon as I got on. You could perhaps use that as the response to a question, but it would not satisfy as a complete sentence. Well, that's because you have a subordinating connector right here, as soon as. Now the question, of course, is what kind of connector is it? What kind of information is it connecting? Is it an adjective? Is it a noun? Or is it an adverb complex idea? Well, if you notice, it tells us something. The bus left, and then notice the expression as soon as is a time expression. So in other words, it's telling us when the bus left. It left as soon as I got on, like right at that very minute. So what you've created here is basically a complex sentence that has an adverb clause. So in this case, this would be considered a complex sentence. And again, part of it was all begun with the fact that it has a subordinating connector right at the beginning. Okay, let's look at our next example. Our teacher, who, and there's that word there again, that connector, has a wonderful sense of humor. So notice in this case, this is very much like the example we saw earlier in the video. We have two commas here to separate the idea. And we have this complete idea that, again, has a verb, but this could not exist as a complete sentence. You could not say, who has a wonderful sense of humor. First off, it is missing a clear subject. Well, this is because we learned that adjective clauses often use a word that's already in the independent idea. So in this case, it's borrowing the word teacher as the subject of this part. So this dependent clause is describing the word teacher. It's not just any teacher, it's the teacher who has a wonderful sense of humor. So in this case, we've identified an adjective clause. And I'll abbreviate there. Now the final example is a little tricky. If you notice, there is a conjunction, the word and here. So you could say perhaps that this might have been a compound sentence, and certainly you could say that this looks like a compound idea. But I didn't want to leave it as a compound sentence, mainly because we do have this other part at the beginning. And part of it is, if you notice, it is separated by a comma, which is usually a first sign that this is not, that these two parts are not the compound idea. Well, again, if you go to the beginning of the sentence, you'll see the word if. If is another example of that subordinating connector. We also see another subject and another verb, but remember, if all of this is a dependent idea, the if would have to go with it. And once again, this does not make a complete idea. If I get married someday. This would not be a satisfactory complete sentence by itself. So in this case, it's connecting to the other part of the sentence in some way. In other words, it depends on it. Well, once again, it is telling us something about the verb. It tells us when or in what situation we would hope to buy a house. And that situation would be if I get married someday. Now, this technically is not an adverb of time. It's actually what we would call an adverb of condition. The condition is, I would like to buy this house, but the condition is I have to get married. So in this case, this is another adverb, but technically it would be considered an adverb of condition. Now, another thing that is here to help you recognize that it is an adverb clause is the fact that it's also at the beginning of the sentence, and it's separated by a comma. This is something we'll discuss more as you get into the advanced grammar class, talking about these possible locations where adverb clauses can be found. So as we have seen throughout this video series, the key to understanding and improving our knowledge of grammar is based on our ability to recognize relationships. These relationships can be defined by basic patterns that allow us to identify their individual parts while also telling us what is and isn't possible if we wanted to add more. It all began with our ability to recognize the individual parts of speech. So think of those as like the musical notes of language. But remember, notes by themselves, that's not enough. In order for us to make sense of these notes, we needed to understand how they go together. And not just go together in any way, but in a logical and sometimes often interesting way. Now, after that, we began to put together what we call little motifs, small groups of words that just seem to belong together. For example, we talked about how subjects and verbs seem to go together, or prepositional phrases seem to go together. Then we were able to begin putting these groups together to create a kind of melody, which is a larger pattern of ideas that make sense and may even be pleasing to hear. So if we had to, again, come back to our musical connection, think of these few notes, for example, this measure, as we called it at the beginning. A measure, of course, is where we see a bar. So kind of think of that as a period for a moment. Well, a simple sentence, in a way, is kind of like this single measure. We have one independent clause. And that independent clause can be defined as a subject and a predicate idea. But as we've seen throughout this series, subjects and predicates can be very simple, or they can become very complicated. For example, a subject could be just a single noun, or a simple noun phrase like an article in a noun, or a little bit longer noun phrase with an article and an adjective and then a noun, or even adding prepositional phrases. Predicates could be as simple as verbs, or contain verbs and adverbs, or if they're action verbs, need an object, and of course could add adverbs and prepositional phrases to those as well. So again, the key here is that subjects and predicates, these are kind of general labels. They're very flexible labels. They can be as small or as large as we need them to be. Now, what if we add two measures? Well, again, the idea is, think of now, instead of this bar as being a period, it's a way to help connect information. Now these measures are connected together in some larger idea. We have an independent clause connected to another independent clause with some sort of coordinating conjunction idea. And again, we have basically that one complete subject and predicate connected with one of these particular words. And again, these are not all of the words that can serve this function, but these are the most common. To another subject and predicate idea. Finally, we think about complex sentences. And notice in this case, we've got, again, a single measure perhaps, but then we have a different kind of note. This is where you have an independent clause, which again require these subjects and predicate ideas. But then we needed to add something new, a dependent clause. And this dependent clause now can serve many different functions. For example, a noun clause could serve now as the subject of a sentence. Or if we had an adjective clause, the adjective clause could describe the noun that's in the subject phrase. Or if we had adverb clauses could replace or add, serve as in addition to other adverbs in the sentence, but they would generally fall either before or after sentence or the verb idea. Of course, part of the predicate would also involve the object. Well, you could have a verb that's followed by a noun clause, which would serve as the object of the sentence. It's difficult, of course, to catch all of our mistakes. Some will be easier to recognize than others. But the idea here is to think about the more that we train our ear, the more we become sensitive to these problems, the more that we recognize these patterns, the better we'll become. And finally, remember, just because you hit a few bad notes doesn't mean you should stop trying. The only way you'll get better is through practice. In our next video course, we will continue exploring the ideas of sentence structure, including revisiting and expanding this concept of complex sentences. And then we will also fine-tune our knowledge of various grammatical patterns and relationships, while also identifying problem areas that can cause confusion for English students. Thanks for watching. Please watch our new video series, which is currently in production, Advanced Grammar.